scriptures that we already read, and I'm going to put them in the context of the trumpets, of this history that we've just learned. So let's reread the scripture. And the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. And the third part of the trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. Now, Edward Gibbons says that during this time, the pastures of Gaul, in which the flocks and herds grazed, were suddenly changed into a desert, distinguished from the solitude of nature only by smoking ruins. These barbarians, when they got on the move, came through with an earnest. They rode on horseback, they swarmed down out of the mountains, they burned everything that was in their way, burned villages, whole forests, everything. They didn't care. It was slash and burn, just like we did over there in Vietnam. You know, that's how you're going to get the enemy. They're hiding in the woods, you burn the woods. They're hiding in the village, burn the village. Doesn't matter. That's the way they behaved. Like hail, the barbarians battered at the northern frontiers of the Roman Empire, first in one place and then another. In AD 410, Alaric the Visigoth meaning Western Goths, Ostrogoths are the Eastern Goths. In 410, Alaric the Visigoth conquered the city of Rome, and he died shortly thereafter, like in 6 months. He was dead. He was only 40 years old. But he died. This prompted the superstition that he died because he attacked the city of God. This superstition was used to try to ward off any more barbarian attacks. You know, this man died because he attacked Rome, so don't attack Rome or you're going to die. Didn't work. The second trumpet sounded, and as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood, and a third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third part of the ships were destroyed. The Vandals worked all through this area, like I said, from 440 to 455. They swarmed. They had been originally in Spain. They got in an argument among their own Spanish people, their own people that had settled in Spain. And like I said, it didn't cause much for them to have an argument one amongst the other. So Genseric loaded up 80,000 people into ships. And he sailed from Spain to northern Africa. And he established himself there in northern Africa, and within 10 years he had conquered all that area, not really by fighting, but just by assimilation. There were Catholics in that area. During this time period Augustine was in Carthage. That was his home. He lived there during this Vandal invasion. But when the Vandals came in, it was really a much better situation. That's, if you can imagine that. But under the Romans, you had very class distinction. You had the very wealthy, and everybody else was poor. There was no middle class. All the artisans, people who worked at trades, who ran the shops, they were considered poor, and they were poor because they were under debt to the wealthy. But the wealthy didn't like being wealthy because they were taxed. Nobody wanted to run the government because if you were a senator or if you were in charge of the city, if there was a shortfall in expenses to run the city, you were expected as a leader of the city to fork the money out yourself to pay the bills. So nobody wanted to be in the government. I mean, it was a terrible time to live in Rome during it because government really was non-existent. Even though we had all these emperors and whatnot, the local city government and the local area government just didn't exist. So when the Vandals came in, if you owed a Roman, didn't matter because the Vandals were in charge. If you lost your property, didn't matter. You got it back because the Vandals reestablished all this. So for the people, the common people who were slaves, they were set free. They no longer had to live under the rule of these wealthy people. So it really wasn't a terrible time when these Vandals moved into northern Africa. Things really got better living-wise. So in 10 years, the Vandals established themselves, and they began to work out of northern Africa in ships, and they conquered all those islands. You know, right at the boot of Italy, you have Sicily, and then you've got some other islands that go up on the western side there of Italy in the Mediterranean Sea. They conquered all those islands. Then they began to concentrate on conquering Italy itself. So they were working from the south, while the Ostrogoths were pushing down from the north in Italy. There wasn't any of this struggle and fight taking place on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. It was just Italy that was being concentrated on, because that's where the Catholic Church was being established. God was using these trumpets to try to bring correction to his church that had gone awry. The Vandals conquered all these islands. Then in 339, get my dates straight, in 339, the Vandals moved into Italy and began to persecute and try to move into Rome. Now, you know Rome is inland, but there's a river that runs out into the Mediterranean Sea. The Roman fleet was harbored in this mouth of the river. There were 1,300 ships there at this time. The Vandals, under cover of darkness, towed some of their ships loaded with combustibles into the harbor among the Roman fleet, set fire to them, and burned up 1,300 ships in one night. Destroyed the Roman fleet in one night.
This was the Vandals.
This is the Vandals did this. In AD 55, he pushed all the way in to Rome and conquered Rome. He raided, pillaged, captured the city of Rome, carted off Roman citizens as slaves, took them back to northern Africa, and the Vandals maintained all the islands in North Africa and power over these for quite some time. Now, the third angel, Scripture says, and the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon a third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters and upon the name, and the name of the star was Wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. During the time, like I said, that Genseric, the Vandal, was pushing up from the south, the Goths were pushing down from the north, and one of the main Gothic generals, or tribal leaders, was Attila. Attila just kind of punched here and he punched there, and he just kind of played around because he was collecting tribute. He said, I won't come against war if just pay me some money and give me some gold, and I'll leave you alone. And he did. He would rather sit around in his tent and get rich than fight war. But if you pushed him, he'd go to war. So in 351, in response to a request from Genseric, he did cross the mountains and stormed down into northern Italy, and they were going to meet in Rome. Genseric from the south, Attila from the north. Well, Attila got all the way to the city of Rome and then backed off. Attila got to Italy ahead of Genseric, but he made a peace treaty with Pope Leo I, and he didn't actually enter the city. It's said that Attila is called the Scourge of God. That's a label that was put on him by a Christian hermit who met him as he was rumbling down through the northern parts of Italy. He came out and he said, "Thou art the scourge of God, sent to chastise the Christian church." Attila took that title. He liked it. He knew who the Christians were, so he called himself the scourge of God. The blazing meteor metaphor works because he came down out of the north very quickly on horseback. It said that they rode one and pulled 3 horses. They lived on horses. All the treaties that they ever made was on horses. Everything they did was on horses. So these two tribes, working north and south, brought Italy, or the western half of the Roman Empire, to its knees. Attila died in 453, not having conquered much of anything. I mean, he pillaged and burned and did everything else, but he didn't actually conquer Rome. Attila the Hun began his harassment of the eastern section of the Roman Empire before Genseric reached Rome. Both were invading parts of Rome during the same time periods of history, one of them from the south, the other from the north. Genseric's final march on Rome occurred in AD 55, but Attila died 2 years before that, in 453. The prophecies must be evaluated more by how the symbols apply than by strictly adhering to the dates, because some of the books I looked at said that Attila was the second trumpet and Genseric the third. Others said no, Genseric was the second and Attila was the third. So I scratched my head and I said, how do they come